I'm joined by Dr. Judson Brewer. Dr. Judson Brewer is a New York Times best-selling author and thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery, who blends over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training and a career in scientific research, a very fascinating blend of two different worlds. Dr. Judd is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, thought leader, and scientific researcher in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery. He's the founder of Mind Sciences and Director of Research and Innovation at the Brown University Mindfulness Center. Formerly, he served as an associate professor in medicine and psychiatry at UMass Medical School, an adjunct faculty member at Yale University, and a research affiliate at MIT. Dr. Judd has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's trained USA Olympic coaches. His work has been featured on 60 Minutes, Time Magazine, Forbes, BBC, NPR, Business Week, and many other prominent media outlets. And his TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, which is really where I found him many years ago, is the fourth most viewed TED Talk of 2016 with over 13 million views to date. What I find most fascinating about this episode, which you're going to enjoy, I'm sure, is just how Dr. Judd blends the two worlds of, science, data, analysis, and the spiritual world, meditation, and how that can help us heal the brain. And he looks at it very from that scientific factor. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Let's get stuck in. Welcome to the show, Dr. Judd. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So the bit I'm really fascinated about, this is a long time coming for me. I've watched your stuff. I've seen your things. I mentioned this just before we started that, 2018, I think, is when I first hooked onto you. And the bit that fascinated me the most was that you sort of come from this very scientific, structured background, the proper scientist thinking, and yet you are absolutely in the spiritual world. Well, not you personally, but you're focused in the spiritual world and meditation and mindfulness, and it's like the marrying of two worlds collided. Just before you go into that, I just want to tell you a very quick story. So back in 2016, I had the opportunity to meet the Dalai Lama, and it was in Pisa, and he'd been invited to the University of Pisa to speak about they'd invited the top quantum physicist from around Italy. And he was invited there because what was uniting was the latest research in quantum physics and, centuries-old science or rather beliefs from Buddhism, and that these things were ultimately merging. And you embody that sort of connection of the two parts of the world. That's why I'm so excited to have you on the show. So, tell me a bit about your background and how this all came together.
Well, before I do that, let me ask a question about that's a great story. And, like you said these Buddhist beliefs, but my understanding, and we can get into this in the show, is that the Buddha was very much a scientist and he was just looking at to see how the mind worked. So I'm curious why you qualify that statement with beliefs as compared to, empirical, data of the mind.
Amazing. That statement is enough.
Okay. So we'll get into it.
Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
Well, my background was, certainly, there's this myth of the 10,000 hour rule, which is more belief than science, but it sells books and it's an easy number to remember. So, I certainly had more than 10,000 hours of suffering in my life, when I started medical school, and I was actually really stressed out as a medical student. And certainly come to this from a privileged background, but, being a white male, and having a lot of education, et cetera. But when I started medical school, I was really stressed out, having struggling with sleeping and just being pretty stressed. And I started meditating my first day of medical school. It seemed like a big transition in my life, so a good place to try something new.
Where did you find out about the meditation, though? Because how long ago was this?
This was back in the mid-90s.
So yeah, exactly. How did that come into your world?
Yeah, I know the internet hadn't really been born yet. So I somehow, and I can't remember how it happened, but this John Kabat-Zinn book landed in my lap.
The Godfather.
Yeah, and there were these things called cassette tapes. Do you remember what those
Oh
are?
yeah, I do.
So I put them in my cassette player and started listening to, well, more accurately, I started falling asleep to these meditations every morning, before I would go to class, and realized that I had no idea how my mind worked. No idea.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start to learn to see how my mind works. So I started, and the meditation piece was there, as a stress reduction piece as a place to start. So I started meditating, I'd pay attention to my breath during boring medical school lectures and whatnot, just as a way to, feel like I was doing something productive. And I started seeing, even as I went through my MD PhD program, how little is actually known about the mind itself. Often, neuroscientists will focus on the neural mechanisms of things and the cellular mechanisms and the system neuroscience, et cetera. Yet this question around, what is the mind and how can we actually learn how our minds work and work with them pragmatically has been skirted in the sense that the pragmatic heuristics that people approach behavior change are actually not grounded in science.
Yeah.
Yet the scientists haven't really spent time pragmatically. I shouldn't say all of them, but I don't want to make a blanket statement. A lot of folks are really interested on just understanding these mechanisms. I'm interested on translating these mechanisms to behavior change, because to me, if we're not going to help somebody better their life, I don't care. I don't care what the molecular neuroscience is of X, Y, and Z, unless I can see a pathway to it helping someone.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And so your fascination of starting to meditate at school, it's really interesting. You talk about the stress level. How much do you realize now that meditation is like a medication for stress?
Oh, 100% now, especially because there are no specific medications for stress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is something I've kind of put into my own mind. From a young age, I realized I was ADHD. I was diagnosed ADHD. And later in life, I sort of decided to mark myself, and this is not for everyone, I understand, but I said, look, I'm sick. My natural way of being is to stick. If I don't do anything, then I actually get sicker. If I do nothing. So there's and the only way that I can stay and maintain a healthy, psychological, healthy life, or good mental health is for me to medicate, and that medication is absolutely meditation. So, so when you brought meditation into your life, what started to happen for you?
Well, I started to see how crazy my mind was. I can say this as a psychiatrist, it's like, wow, my mind was all over the place. And I had no idea that was normal. And then that was actually okay. I also started to notice how I was running after my mind, trying to hold on to pleasant things and push away unpleasant things. And that I was actually causing a huge amount of my own suffering through that, frenetic activity of trying to control my mind. The irony here was that, letting go was the ultimate form of control when it comes to my mind.
That is where most people are, what you just described, isn't it? This is where most people are, is they're stuck in a loop of causing their own suffering.
Yeah, and they don't know it, right? Most people don't know that this is actually a habit. I've got story after story of patients in my clinic who come in, they have no idea what's causing their anxiety or their addiction. I had somebody that was actually referred for alcohol use, where he'd been drinking 6 to 8 hard drinks a night. And as we started mapping out this process, he realized that it was actually, he'd wake up in the morning, he'd feel anxious. He would watch movies. He worked from home. He would watch movies to procrastinate from all the work he needed to get done. And then he realized that the procrastination didn't get the work done. So he would start drinking in the afternoon and into the evening. And then, of course, not get work done when he was inebriated, and then wake up the next morning and do the same thing over. And so he had to treat the root cause of his issue, which was anxiety. And when he started treating that, when he started addressing that directly, the drinking for him fell away much more easily than trying to say, okay, just stop drinking, which is the standard paradigm. Avoid those people, places, and things. To which I say, good luck. It's not always easy to do.
Exactly. This is something really important, because the stop mentality, or the just don't do it, or willpower, you've got some pretty strong thoughts on that. And also the science shows us, or certainly the science that you've been working on is showing that. So tell me more about what you're seeing here. Why does that not work? What's going on?
Well, as an addiction psychiatrist, and I guess as a neuroscientist, I wanted to test that theory first. And so, I learned in residency how to help advise people to avoid things, and to, give them medications for withdrawal, or go into detox if they need to for alcohol, et cetera. And I was finding over and over and over that my patients weren't actually doing better. And sure, it could just be that I was a terrible psychiatrist, and that may still be true. But it may also be true that the theories that I had been taught in medical school weren't actually in line with neuroscience. So as a neuroscientist, started looking at this to see, what are we learning clinically, and is that lining up? The dominant paradigm, as you're talking about, is this willpower. Well, at best, if you look at the brain and cognitive control seems to be seated in the prefrontal cortex. Certainly it's complex. There are a lot of networks involved, but that seems to be a main hub. And ironically, the prefrontal cortex is the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed, which is one of the primary... What's that?
And also when we drink alcohol, right?
And also when we drink alcohol. Yes. So let me get this straight. You're supposed to use the part of the brain that when you're drinking doesn't work, and when you're stressed doesn't work. And then stress leads to drinking, which then leads to more stress. And then you're in a mess, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at that, that's at best. Now, if you double click on cognitive control, the equations for control and behavior change in neuroscience have nothing to do with willpower. They don't include willpower in the equations because it is more myth than muscle.
Yeah.
It's just a nice thing that we can say, oh, if I only had more willpower and there's something wrong with me, and then we can blame ourselves, and then we can judge ourselves, and then we can drink some more, and then we can say, oh, my life is out of control, and there's nothing I can do about this. And then we're stuck in the mess, even more stuck in the mess, because we're like, well, they tell me just to stop, but I can't stop. So it must be something wrong with me as compared to something wrong with the formula or the paradigm. So let's look at the paradigm as compared to the person.
Yeah. This is touching on an area that I feel not bad about is the wrong thing, because I know that we are doing great things. But I know that what happens is, with a digital program as an example, or a book. Okay, so let's say in our program, it's like, hey, come and stop drinking for a bit. Now, I know we have fantastic content in there. In fact, I'm pretty sure since we launched this back in maybe 2016, we've linked to some of your content in our program, the TED Talk. And so part of this is, hey, here's these tools for you. But what often people don't do is they don't really apply that. They stuck in this willpower bit, and they're trying and trying and trying. And then what we see is they manage to abstain for a bit, but it comes back, and it comes back worse for many, many people. And this is pretty much what you're describing now, is that ultimately they've used too much willpower instead of using instead of doing what is different.
Yeah, instead of using awareness. And you're describing the abstinence violation effect, which has been studied pretty well and is pretty extensively described, where, it's like the more you force yourself not to have something, the more your brain wants it.
Yeah.
And so as soon as that dam overflows with water or breaks, then the water is going to all rush downhill. And that's where, people go on benders or binges or whatever after they've stopped for a while, and then beat themselves up and think, oh, this is hopeless.
Yeah.
I've done this 8 times before and it hasn't worked the last 8. So why is it going to work this time? And then they get this defeatist mentality. So instead of that, or I should say, no matter where somebody's coming from, no matter how many times they've had, in the diet industry, it's the same thing. So they call it yo-yo dieting.
Totally.
You lose some weight, you gain it back, you lose some weight, you gain it back. So you could think of this as yo-yo abstinence or yo-yo whatever, yo-yo drinking, where somebody stops for a while and then they feel like they can't do it, and then they, go back and then they stop again. So instead of getting on that roller coaster, which certainly is a huge roller coaster for a lot of people, let's employ some neuroscience. And for me, it's interesting because this neuroscience is based in, if you look back historically to see who came up with this idea in the first place, it's described back in ancient Buddhist psychology from 2,500 years ago, before paper was even invented. They described the basic process for how addiction gets set up, and they described how you can get out of it. So we've studied those to see, how well does this work. My first study I did back when I was a resident with people with alcohol and cocaine use disorder. So they could have one or both, because often, people, anyway. So we found that it was mindfulness training. So where we help people start paying attention as they drank or used cocaine, that was as good as gold standard treatment as cognitive behavioral therapy in helping prevent people from relapsing. That was a small study. It was our first one, so we needed to, replicate it. But we also found that it was better at helping people not be as reactive to stressors, which was important to study because that's one of the triggers for relapse. And we went on to then say, okay, let's look at smoking, for example, to see if we can help people quit smoking instead of using the willpower or whatever. Again, randomized controlled trial with an active comparator. So we compared it to cognitive therapy, the best one out there, the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking. Ready for this? We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And we could start to look at the mechanisms. So we've looked at the psychological and the behavioral mechanisms. We've even done neuroimaging to look at the neuroscience mechanisms. And what we found is completely consistent with what is known from mice to men, so to speak, in terms of the reinforcement learning literature, is that, we learn these habitual patterns through reinforcement learning. So positive and negative reinforcement. You're at a party, you're having fun, you drink some alcohol, you associate drinking alcohol with having fun, and then you get in this loop of, when I want to have fun, I drink, or when I want to feel good, I drink. And then also the people like my patient that I mentioned, when they're anxious, there's the trigger, they drink to make the trigger go away or to avoid it, and then they reinforce that through negative reinforcement. So that part is pretty well established. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize in the year 2000, showing that it's evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So we then employed that and said, well, instead of telling people to just stop drinking or avoid, the people, places, and things, can we help them pay attention to the results of their behavior? So the one ingredient that's needed here, so we've done this studies with smoking, we've done this with smoking, with even with studies of people overeating, because it's the same mechanism.
Yeah.
When people pay attention, they get what's called, in neuroscience terms, one of two things: a positive or a negative prediction error. And what that means, what that translates to, is we set up a reward value of a certain behavior based on positive and negative reinforcement. We keep doing it habitually if we don't pay attention to how rewarding it actually is in the moment right now.
Mm-hmm.
To update that reward value, you need one simple thing, which is awareness. And if you pay attention and it's better than expected, you get this positive prediction error. That's the error, just means that it's different than what you expected. And if it's worse than expected, you get a negative prediction error, and you learn both ways. So if it's positive, you're more likely to do it again. If it's negative, you become disenchanted with it. So with smoking is probably the simplest example. When I have people pay attention when they smoke, they realize that cigarettes taste like crap.
Yeah.
And I've had patients come back and say,
disgusting.
how did I not notice this before? I've been smoking 40 years. One guy we calculated, he'd reinforced this loop about 300,000 times.
Wow.
And he hadn't paid attention to, how crappy cigarettes tasted. When he did that, he couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee that. So I do that. I really have my patients pay attention, and ask the simple question: what am I getting from this? Right. And this has been described in other terms like play the tape forward. You know, if somebody's thinking about having a drink, what next? You have another drink. What next? Another drink. What next? Well, you're going to get in a fight, or, you know, all the downstream consequences. So they can kind of play that tape forward to see how rewarding the behavior actually is while they're not inebriated, so they can see clearly what the results are. They can also do this afterwards. You know, I've had tons of patients who, you know, the next morning they wake up and they have the hangover, they feel anxious, all these things, they feel guilty. And so they can then compare what's it like to have that versus, you know, what it was like to have the intoxication. Well, especially if they can't remember what it was like the night before, they start to see how unrewarding it is. And then they can compare it to the greater reward that comes from not drinking. So I had a patient who, she finally quits drinking at the age of 50. She'd been drinking probably 30 years, like heavily, like really problematic. And, you know, it was really ruining her life. And, you know, so I had her start paying attention in the mornings when she hadn't had to drink the night before. She wakes up, she feels much better. She doesn't feel guilty. She has a good relationship with her teenage children who are, you know, hey, mom didn't drink it. You know, they're very happy. And we started having her recall those moments when she had urges to drink. And then she could compare them. She could give her brain a choice, be like, how's it feel? And not like choosing like, oh, I should do this, not in a thinking way, but feeling into her direct experience. What was it like the last time I drank versus what was it like the last time I didn't drink? And hopefully it was this morning or today. Then we let our brain make the decision. Whichever's more rewarding is going to win anyway. So if we just put that clarity on it, using that awareness, that's how we update the reward value. I'll say one more thing. We did a study with overeating even, and we found that it only takes 10 to 15 times. We even use this is an app-based mindfulness training program called Eat Right Now, where we embedded this craving tool to have people pay attention as they overeat. It doesn't take long for that reward value to drop below zero, where they get all these negative prediction errors, because it just doesn't feel good to overeat, because our body is really smart, it's really wise, and it says, why are you doing this? I don't need more food.
Yeah.
And it gives us those signals to stop. We just have to pay attention to this.
Just have to listen. Yeah, absolutely. And okay, so there's the conceptual idea of awareness, so the conscious idea of awareness, which is what most people are probably thinking about what you're saying now, what awareness is. And then there's the whole nother level of awareness, which is given from meditation. In fact, I would go as far as to say, which I'm sure you agree, that once you've got into a routine of meditation and you have started to find that it's not uncomfortable and 100% distraction, everything else, I don't know what that point is. We can talk about that. The awareness is totally life transforming. It's an inside awareness. It's like a knowing as opposed to conceptually thinking. Do you agree with what I've just said? And is there some science around that you could?
Yeah, so I agree, and I think we can double click on this more. The knowing, I would say, comes from the wisdom of our direct experience. So that awareness has to come from direct experience. It can't come from thinking. I think of my shorthand for this is that our feeling body is much wiser and much stronger than our thinking brain. So if we could just think our way out of drinking or whatever, we would. My clinic would be transformed, because I'd have one visit with each patient and tell them to stop, and then they'd stop, whatever it was.
Done.
You know, worrying, drinking, overeating, whatever. And then the world would be a better place. We'd tell people that like to, you know, harm other people to stop doing that, and they would stop doing it. You know, it's like, doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Logic is not here.
Yeah.
We're not going to think your way out of this.
Yeah. So our feeling body is much wiser and stronger than our thinking brain. That's the critical element for any type of behavior change, is to really feel into the direct experience. And it's going to tell us everything we need to know.
Amazing. Yeah. So tell me about the what's actually happening when we are starting to meditate or meditating as a practice. What are we seeing from a neuroscience perspective in the brain?
And here I'll say before we dive into that, that it's not just about, often people think, oh, I should meditate, I should spend 10 to 30 minutes or an hour or whatever a day. And if I don't, I'm a bad person, right? What we found was that in one of our studies, actually our smoking study, that the informal mindfulness practices were even stronger than the formal, meditation practices. So if somebody's listening to this and they think, oh, I should meditate, but I don't have time, we've actually adapted all of our app-based mindfulness training programs to start with the informal, like in the moment practices, so that anybody can do it anytime they're doing something. So especially, if they're about to smoke a cigarette, they can pay attention, right? It doesn't take more time because they're about to smoke the cigarette anyway. If they're eating, they can pay attention as they eat. As if they're about to drink or even as they're drinking, they can pay attention as they do that. So I don't want people to think that they have to meditate in order to get the benefits of mindfulness. I think of meditation as a smaller circle within the larger circle. If you think of Venn diagrams, it's a way to help train awareness, but it's not the only way. And there are many, many other ways to do that as well. So what's going on in the brain? It's a good question. Over 10 years ago, we asked the same question and started. So we just did some basic neuroimaging studies with expert versus novice meditators. Long story short, we found, so first, my primary hypothesis was disproven. I thought there was going to be some region in the brain or network that was going to increase in activity when somebody was meditating. Because at the time, I sort of felt like I was working hard to meditate, right? So I figured, there must be something happening. And we didn't find a single brain region that was increased in activity as compared to in experts versus novices. But we did find that expert meditators were decreasing activity in a primary network of brain regions called the default mode network. The funny thing about this default mode network is it's aptly named because it's what we default to when we're not doing anything in particular, which is thinking about ourselves. Yeah. So we tend to be thinking about the past or the future. Often we're regretting things we've done in the past or worrying about the future. And also that default mode network gets pretty active with addiction. Tons of different studies showing addictions ranging from cocaine to cigarettes to gambling to you name it, will activate this default mode network. So we looked at this a little bit more where we could use real-time neurofeedback and give people feedback from their own brains in real time, whether they're in the fMRI scan or even using a specialized EEG rig, where we found that it seems to be when somebody's getting caught up in their experience, that's when this default mode network gets activated. So whether we get caught up in worrying or we get caught up in a craving, that getting caught upness, that stickiness, that's what gets us, that's what gets us hooked into moving into a behavior. Now, I mention all of that because what we found with these studies and number of studies we've done, and now these studies have been replicated by other labs, is that this default mode network gets really quiet when somebody's meditating. So when somebody's meditating, they're not getting caught up in their experience. They're noticing their experience. They're becoming aware of it, but they're not running after it and they're not trying to push it away. So it's this, they're giving it space to come and go. They're giving these thoughts space to come and go. They're giving these feelings space to come and go. And they're realizing these things come and go. As a pragmatic example, and then we'll go back to the neuroscience. I had a patient who came in, who said, he walks into my office. This is early in my career. And he goes, "Doc, if I don't smoke, my head's going to explode." And I'm thinking, oh no, what do I do? Chief complaint, head exploding. Never had this one before. Didn't see this one as in residency. So I fall back to my old habit, which is to go up to my whiteboard and pull out a marker and start drawing. And so I said, okay, describe what head exploding feels like. And so I had him describe his craving and, in words and then in intensity. And I started drawing in a line with the mapping onto his intensity. So it was going up and up and up as he was describing tightness and tension and restlessness and all these things where that intensity of the craving was going up. And then at one point it peaked. The intensity peaked and started to go back down. And he got this look across his face. And I said, "Well, what just happened?" He said, "Well, I always smoke before it peaks." And I didn't realize that I don't have to smoke. It'll go away on its own. So we did this shared exercise, let's say, of awareness, where I had him describe his experience and I was just mapping it out on the board. And he saw a couple of things. One, that these sensations come and go. And two, that he doesn't have to do anything to make them go away. All he has to do is be with them. So I think of it as being is the new doing. If we can be with our experience, we don't need to do anything else because these cravings are going to come and go. Now, the first question I get from patients and people in our programs is, well, what if this craving lasts a long time or lasts forever? So I ask people, well, have you ever had a craving that's lasted forever, right? Because you have it right now. Nobody's ever said yes to that, but they say, well, they feel like they last a long time. So I have them time them. I say, okay, start a stopwatch the next time you have a craving and see how long it lasts. Get really curious. The longest one to date, at least in my clinic and in my, we've had thousands of people use our app-based mindfulness training programs, has been 13 minutes. So might seem like a long time in the moment, but 13 minutes, it's not that long, So That's really about, and what we also find is that the more you bring curiosity in, right? This awareness is really about curiosity. So if you look at these reinforcement learning mechanisms, they're called reward-based learning for a reason, because if they're rewarding, we're going to keep doing them. We're going to learn to keep doing them. And if they're not rewarding, we're going to learn to stop doing them. So I can have my patients compare what it's like to get curious about a craving versus just be sucked into the craving itself. Well, you tell me what feels better, curiosity or a craving?
Yeah, absolutely. Curiosity.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
So we can give our brain, I call it the bigger, better offer. We can give our brain something better. And so our brain's going to learn, oh, curiosity feels better than craving. And that curiosity can actually help us work with the craving itself. So let's go back to the neuroscience. The feeling of, well, let me ask you another, sorry to keep quizzing you, but let me ask you another question. If you had to pick, does craving feel more contracted or more expanded?
Contracted, absolutely.
Okay. And does curiosity feel more contracted or expanded?
Expanded.
Yeah. So what we find with the neuroscience is that when people bring curiosity in, think of that getting caught up in our experience, that default mode network activity as being this contracted, feeling contracted, feeling closed down. When you bring curiosity in, you start to open that up, and that's where the default mode network gets quiet. It starts to quiet down as we're less caught up, and also as we start to let go of that being caught up or being identified with our experience. Often we're like, oh, this craving is me, where we realize, oh, it's just sensations. And as we become less identified, that openness probably correlates with a decreased activity in the default mode network. Mm-hmm. And this even, if you look at, people have done studies with psychedelics, like magic mushrooms, things like that.
Wait to talk about that.
Yeah, these are called mind expanding drugs, right? Because you're expanding. And if you expand to the point where you lose a sense of self, right? That's, Csikszentmihalyi describes this as flow, where there's a selfless quality of experience, which is extremely rewarding. It feels much better than being caught up in a craving. So to summarize the piece about the neuroscience, it seems that this network of activity, this default mode network, if we're not aware of it, we're going to default to it, about 50% of waking life, according to some studies. And if we are aware of it, we can see how painful it is when we get caught up in our experience, whether it's identifying with a craving or even just identifying with anything. Oh, I'm a drinker, I'm a smoker, I'm an overeater, I'm a whatever. All of that causes suffering. So we can start to disidentify, become less identified with these things, and at the same time, likely quiet that default mode network activity down.
Super powerful, really powerful. So many things to come out of that I want to dial back into. Hopefully my ADHD brain will allow me to. But one thing, if I think about this craving in the moment, it is incredibly powerful, right? That's one thing. But also is that I'm just going to get taken along. So the craving comes and I'm going to get taken along. And at some point there has to be a conscious decision to say, I'm going to bring curiosity in. Or there has to be a trigger, or there has to be something that makes me say, I'm going to do something different other than follow the thing I've always followed.
Mm-hmm.
So starting at that bit there, what is the tool? Is it asking yourself a question? Is it, how do you pull out an app and follow the craving buster plan? Or how do you choose to deviate away from, I'm just going to go down the road? Because it does have to be some kind of decision there. Excuse me.
Yeah. So often it starts retrospectively, where we're looking back on our experience and often regretting, oh, I can't believe I did that, right?
Yeah.
So that helps us look back at our experience and become disenchanted with whatever the unhelpful behavior was.
Yeah.
That disenchantment piece is really key. So I think of this in 3 steps, and I wrote about this in the Unwinding Anxiety book. But the idea here is, first we have to identify that we're in a habit. And often it's going to take something painful that says, hey, wake up to this. This isn't helping you,
Totally.
right? So often that's why all patients will come into me, because they're suffering.
Yeah.
So there's got to be some level of suffering, or we're not going to stop doing it. And if there's no suffering, then it's hard to see where something is a unhelpful habit or an addiction, right? Because typically, the common definition that I like about addiction is continued use despite adverse consequences.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. So if we're not seeing adverse consequences, our brain's not starting to wake up to the fact that something is is causing harm. So once we wake up, then we start mapping out these habit loops, and it really just starts with the behavior. What's the behavior? It could be drinking, it could be smoking, it could be yelling at people, anger, it could be anything, procrastinating. And once we wake up and, oh, I'm in this habit loop, that's the first step. The second step, simple question, what am I getting from this, right? That links the behavior with the results of the behavior. That's what reward-based learning is all about, where we see, oh, is this actually rewarding or not? If you go back to Buddhist times, they called it cause and effect. What's the cause? What's the behavior? What's the effect of that behavior? So simple question, what am I getting from this, right? We can do it before we start to, what did I get from it last time? We can do it as we're doing it. What am I getting from this now? And we can do it afterwards. Like, what did I get from this? It doesn't have to be in the moment, especially if somebody is intoxicated. It's hard to pay attention to see what they're actually getting from something. So once that disenchantment starts to build, where they see how unrewarding an unhelpful habit is, the third step is called, I call that finding the bigger, better offer, the BBO. And that's where curiosity and kindness, I would say those two are, they're like best friends. They support each other and they support us along our journeys. We can start to see how good it feels to be curious. And so when we're naturally curious, we can just tap into that. Oh, what's it feel like when I'm curious? Feels good. We can recall times when we've been curious, and we can use that as a way to start training ourselves to tap into this process. So one way to cue that, once we've kind of started to see how the process works, is to just check in with our mind, where it's like, oh, here comes a craving, or oh no, this just happened. I'm stressed. That oh no tends to signal some type of a closed downness or a contraction. Then we can train ourselves, because the more we see how rewarding curiosity feels and how it can be helpful, we can train that to become the new habit. So when we feel oh coming on, we can go, oh, there's that oh. And that oh already feels better. So our brain's going to say, oh, I want some more of that. And so we just train that process, whatever that oh no feels like for us, to be aware of that. That's the trigger to go, oh,
I love that. Yeah.
And directly drop into our embodied experience.
That's a great thing. I mean, I'd written down what's going on for me right now, but that sounds way too complicated and also way too counselorish and questioning. Whereas, oh, sounds so much more opening and as a trigger. So I need to remember that now. If ever I ever feel a craving or something like that, is literally to think first of all of that, oh, to open myself up into curiosity. So
let me ask you, when you just do that, describe what it feels like.
Well, as you can see, it's lightening, it's opening, it's expression, it's encouragement, it's adding energy. There's all of those positive psychology things going on in there at the same time as opening it.
Yeah, and you don't have to remember any positive psychology. All you have to do is do it, and it shows up.
So it's a great tool to begin with. So you've touched on this a couple of times, but we haven't actually centered in on it. And it is this idea or this concept about self or selfishness, self-obsessed, driving addiction. And I think this is really interesting because certainly in our high-level complete control programs, I think this is where we are taking business owners and high achievers, and so there's a huge amount of stress involved. But there's also probably quite a lot of self-centeredness, quite a lot of selfish, because it's that drive and creation and things like that. So that is why we're potentially seeing a higher propensity for addictive behavior. Now, also, I think you could probably touch on the fact that they've been using addiction, other than alcohol and everything else, just a very well-known, acceptable addiction of work. To drive. So, what are your thoughts on that as a concept of being self-obsessed? Tell us more about that.
Yes, and there's even an ontological theory of addiction, which is just a fancy word for saying the self as a something to get addicted to is pretty well worked out in the literature, or at least described. And again, that goes back 2,500 years.
Yeah.
Where the more we get caught up in some concept of ourselves, it's like, oh, I'm a workaholic or I'm a whatever, that fits the same reinforcement learning processes. So I think that fits pretty well with what's known both psychologically and with neuroscience.
Completely. And so interestingly, we were talking about this earlier, the prefrontal cortex. I saw some research recently which shows that yes, alcohol abuse, addiction dulls that prefrontal cortex, and it's dulled more over time, I believe. But also that the parts of the area of the brain, prefrontal cortex, that we use for, like you said, curiosity, awareness, honesty, rebuild that area of the brain. Is that right? Is that what you're seeing?
I haven't not done that research myself, so I'd have to go back and confirm that with the literature. But, I certainly don't see any downsides to curiosity.
Yeah, said like a true scientist there who didn't want to put his name behind anything that wasn't your own. Okay, now again, not talking my own book, but what we see is that this is probably a couple of years ago now. We saw that people were really not ready to come and stop drinking. That was a big barrier for people. Ultimately, they have to get to a point, and I think in AA and things like that, they say you have to reach rock bottom before you're going to change, which I think is all wrong. But I think we can reach our own psychological rock bottom. But there's this. We've talked a bit about not drinking and the potential damage that just abstaining from something is. And you're talking about awareness and trying to get more awareness and getting awareness in the moment. So therefore, surely getting people to control their drinking, getting people to reduce their drinking sounds like it should be a far more, a better way to go about doing this. Is that what you are seeing? And are you helping people to control their drinking?
Yes. So I think of this as, often is described as harm reduction, instead of, often, and it's funny how people get identified with certain camps. So anytime we get identified with a concept, we're going to run into problems, where, somebody's like, oh, you have to be abstinent only, or somebody says, no, abstinence doesn't work. It's got to be harm reduction. I look at the person in front of me and I check to see what's going to be most helpful for them. And so here, it's really helpful to be able to step back and ask, what is most helpful for X, Y, or Z individual right now? And the key there is to really see, I think of this as relative rock bottom. So we could, sure, somebody could lose everything. They could lose all their relationships, all their finances, their house, their apartment, where they live, whatever. Certainly they could hit rock bottom, and there's a lot of suffering there that says, wow, this is not working for me. And then they might be more motivated to, go and seek a way out because they've got nothing else. They've lost their job, lost their family, etc. But I agree with you. You don't have to hit that. We can go to relative rock bottom. And one way to do that is to see how rewarding it is to be stepping out of that hole instead of digging the hole deeper.
Yeah.
So the way to do that is, so you can certainly see how you can pay attention and see how unrewarding drinking is, for example. And you can also pay attention to seeing how rewarding it is not to be drinking, right? And that makes that hole relatively deeper without you digging it deeper, because suddenly you've that bar has gone up where it's like, oh, I actually feel much better. Like I described with my patient who's, she would wake up in the morning and not feel hungover and have a good relationship with her kids. She didn't have to lose everything to achieve that, to gain all that she had been gaining. And then the more those walls got even higher for her to go back to drinking, the more benefits she saw from not drinking. So this is all a relative thing, and it's all based on individual experience.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. And so, do you say that in the moment when you play it forward? I mean, if you're thinking for somebody who is, let's say, in the matrix right now. So that's the thing about alcohol is that you might be in your 20s. And it's not causing you any problems. I mean, hangovers are non-existent, right? And it's only leading to fun and happiness and everything else. So you could be drinking daily, but it's not addiction at that place because it's not causing you any damage. Or
well, if you look at and again, the American Association of Society of Addiction Medicine, they really talk about continued use despite adverse consequences. So if somebody's in their 20s and they're drinking up a storm and they're not having, and this isn't about themselves, they've got to look at everything. So they've got to look at not only their personal experience, but also how they're affecting others as well. Because often people can be oblivious of how their behavior is affecting other people. So I'm going to include, in terms of adverse consequences, we've got to look at the entire story.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if it's not causing any problems, then it wouldn't technically fit into the definition of addiction. And honestly, if people aren't seeing negative consequences, it's going to be really hard to change a behavior.
Yeah, exactly. So there has to be, they have to have that sense of there's some negative impact from this. And actually the first stage is getting awareness of that,
yes.
Is getting truthful about the consequences. Yeah. Okay, so as an example, somebody comes to you, they're drinking, they're more of a binge drinker. They can stop for a bit, but then when they binge drink and it has these negative consequences, what process do you take them through? What direction do you point them in?
Well, I might start with that second step before going back to the first step, because they've got to be motivated to start mapping out these habit loops. So if the habit loop is binging, it's pretty easy to identify it. So they can go to the second step and ask, well, what am I getting from this, right? And they can look at it before they do it. They can look at it while they're binging, and they can look at it afterwards, especially before they get so intoxicated that they can't pay attention. They can really check to see, how rewarding is this? For a lot of people, it actually feels pretty good to have that buzz. That's why it's called a buzz. So they say, well, when I pay attention, I'm actually more excited about it. Right. And so they can start asking, well, where am I hitting that pleasure plateau? Right. Is it one drink? Is it two drinks? Where do I lose the benefits of that buzz where I'm not even paying attention anymore? And then things go off the cliff of overindulgence.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can start asking, well, what are all the consequences that come from this? So, alcohol is expensive, especially if somebody goes out socially drinking. So it can have an effect on the pocketbook, on the finances. It can have an effect on relationships. It can even have subtle effects on our physical being. So even if somebody's in their 20s, nobody's going to say I sleep better when I drink alcohol, because there are no good effects of drinking. Now, if somebody says, well, I don't remember sleeping, that doesn't count as sleeping better. This is about being rested the next day. being able to wake up refreshed, ready to, hop out of bed.
Oh, there are a lot of people out there who think they sleep better after a drink. There are a lot of people who think that.
Yeah.
They just don't know what good sleep is.
Well, and the other piece is they're not looking at the underlying effects. So my lab just published a study where we looked at anxiety and sleep, because one of the major issues related to sleep is the worry that comes. And somebody says, well, if I drink, then I'm not going to worry, because I don't, they numb themselves, or they don't remember, and they go to sleep drunk as compared to worrying. Again, they're just putting a Band-Aid on that wound, and that wound is just going to fester over time. So they really have to treat the underlying causes. For example, with our Unwinding Anxiety app, we actually we got a significant reduction in anxiety, and we also got a significant reduction in sleep disturbance with that. So this is about treating the underlying cause as compared to putting a Band-Aid on, that alcohol Band-Aid.
Amazing. So, and we touched on psychedelics. That is something I'm very passionate about, and have done a lot of done a lot of work here in it, and I think it's going to be I think it's going to be profoundly life-changing for many people, especially around alcohol use disorder and addiction. What are you seeing? What are your thoughts playing that forward?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when we did our first study of experienced meditators, we published our paper in 2011 and in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And 2 or 3 months later, in the same journal, the first paper on psychedelics came out from David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris. And I looked at their findings and I said, no way, this cannot be a coincidence, because they were finding the exact same thing that we were finding with meditation. This default mode network was getting deactivated. So I immediately contacted them, and we're like, this all lines up. So I think of this as psychedelics can show people what it's like to expand the mind. Yet, as the people found in the 60s, you can't just go on, just keep taking psychedelics your whole life. It's hard to operate heavy machinery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, so it causes some of the same problems as alcohol does, right? So if we can train people in the right settings with the right, and settings probably going to be important here, where they've got to be guided. It takes a lot of wraparound to have somebody have a really good psychedelic experience, a good trip, so to speak, as compared to a bad trip.
Yeah.
So if that infrastructure is not set up yet, and it's going to be costly, and it's they've got to work out a lot of things. But I see that as a really promising first step, where you show somebody, boom, this is what mind expanding feels like and experience is, and then you train them using curiosity, for example, to start moving in that direction by themselves without needing additional treatment. So it's like, you pair the two. It's like, show somebody what mind expanding is like, and then train them to expand their mind on their own. In fact, Michael Pollan wrote, who wrote that book, Train Your Mind, which is all his personal experience with psychedelics. It's caught in my brain about what his title is. But anyway,
How to Train Your Mind.
How to Train Your Mind, right. So the last part of his book, he actually writes about, he calls it the coda, where he comes to my lab and we hook him up to our neurofeedback machine. We have him just recall one of his psychedelic trips. So I don't think this is a spoiler alert. It's not like it's a mystery novel that somebody, suddenly I'm going to ruin the ending of his book. So basically just recalling a psychedelic trip did the same type of default mode network deactivation as meditating. Wow. And so that recollection can be really helpful as a way to kind of, this is what mind expanding is like. I can experience this without needing to be going through the setup and the whole, the trip experience itself.
Yeah. It is amazing how this stuff is converging. So I'm so glad to hear you saying that. And looking forward for you, where are you going? What's your mission? What do you want to achieve?
To help as many people become addicted to curiosity as possible. full stop, right?
Boom, mic drop.
Because imagine how the world would be a better place both individually. So we find that curiosity, we, with our unwinding anxiety program, which the core is around helping people develop curiosity in this 3-step process. We did a study with people with generalized anxiety disorder, and we got a 67% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores. Now, just to give you a sense for how this works. So with medications, the best that we have out there, the number needed to treat is 5.2. So about 1 in 5 people benefit. In this study, the number needed to treat was 1.6. So it's like better than 1 in 2 people are going to benefit. And it's not just to say that this, the unwinding anxiety app's the only way to go, but the proof of concept there is, if we can train people to be curious, they can start to unwind any of these unhelpful habits, whether it's, alcohol or even anxiety. So that's where I'm going, is how can we develop simple trainings that can help people really wake up to the power of curiosity and kindness. Kindness is key here too, because there's a lot of self-judgment that's involved in unhelpful habits.
Totally.
Right? How can we help them wake up? And when they start living better lives, the people around them are going to live better lives. And then the people around them are going to live better lives. And so, we start at the individual level, but then we hopefully scale to the societal level where we have, an awakened society where people are curious as compared to mean, and curious instead of selfish, kind instead of mean, all these things where, we need to band together as a species if we're going to stop destroying each other and ourselves and the planet.
Yep.
And that's why I am fully invested in any way that we can do this to really help people wake up to the power of curiosity and kindness. And the nice thing is our brains are set up to move in that direction as long as we really see how powerful these things are.
Yeah.
So we're set up for success. We just have to be able to tap into it.
Amazing. So I was going to ask you this question. Do you think humanity is heading in the right direction? I mean, despite the wars and the threat of wars and all of the stuff that's going on and the things we read in the news and the bad things that people are doing, despite that, do you think we're heading in the right direction?
Well, I think we've put
Nigel Horrocks.
Oh, I'm still there. Did I lose you?
I hear something ringing. This is Nigel Harris. Is that your?
Where did it do that? That's bizarre.
I paused right when it started doing that.
Okay, great.
So I'm guessing you can edit that out.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So I think we've hit some oops buttons societally and for humanity. So, for example, with social media, it's like, if you just cater to the highest bidder who can buy political ads and do, spread conspiracy theories and things like that across the internet, we just found out how strong and potentially dangerous social media is for disconnecting people, because outrage wins over kindness, and people are naturally set up to be drawn in more radicalized ways. That's just how our minds are set up through habituation. So we know this as a species. We've got to wake up to the destructive power of that, because that can be used for nefarious purposes, and that's not going to help us survive as a species. So, we've got to really have our eyes on the prize in terms of what truly is a bigger, better offer. More power, more money, things like that. They only beget wanting more.
Yeah.
They call it, in Buddhism, they call this the hungry ghost. It's this ghost with this small mouth, long, narrow esophagus, and a huge stomach. We're never going to be satisfied. So if you look at, people who are out, destroying other countries, what's enough for them? Nothing is enough. At least my read of it, I haven't met any of these very powerful people who are killing other people, but it doesn't seem like they're happy. Even there's been, look at the former president in the United States, didn't seem particularly happy, but was good at being mean. So can we really wake up to what is important? And can we wake up to the power of kindness and curiosity? If we can do that, I think we can move in the right direction. I don't see us moving quickly enough yet. Yeah. So this is where we all have to start with ourselves.
Taking action. Action. And it all starts with awareness and curiosity.
It does. Full stop.
Let's get addicted to curiosity. Amazing. Thank you so much. There's so much in here that we've gone through. I really appreciate you taking time to go through this. And if people want to find out more about you or get involved in some of the apps, where do they find out more and what should they do?
The easiest way to find out more is my website's just drjudd.com, drjud.com, where they can learn about my books, my apps, but we also have a bunch of free resources that people can just learn and use themselves. We also have, if you want to start mapping out these habits, we have a URL, mapmyhabit.com, which they can also find on my website, but there's a free PDF that they can download just as a way to get started mapping out habits. But my website, drjudd.com, is the best way to get a hold of all this information.
Amazing. Thank you. And thanks again for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.